You're listening to City of Muses on Paris Underground Radio. Hello, and welcome to City of Muses, a brand new podcast on the Paris Underground Radio Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jennifer Garrity, and each week I'll be sitting down with an artist or creative to talk about what inspires them, what their creative process is like, and how Paris fits into it all. This week I'm speaking with Cara Chapman. Cara has always been a dancer. That dancing has taken many forms, and she's been a professional ballet dancer, showgirl, and aerialist for years, performing ballet in places like Lincoln Center in New York and the Opéra National de Paris, aerialism at the Cirque d'Hiver and Club Med, and working as a showgirl in Las Vegas. She's performed all over the world. In fact, she was in the Alps when we spoke, but happily calls Paris home. Hi, Cara. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Hi, I'm happy to.
It's so nice to see you. It's been a very long time since we've actually seen each other in person.
It has. It's been ages.
And I remember when I saw you, when I met you, you were considering moving to Paris and trying to figure out if that was the next phase in your life. And here we are all these years later. How has Paris worked out for you?
I'm super happy with it, to be honest. I have been there for about 7 years now, and I feel like equally as content as the day I arrived. You know, there's always that thing of like when you move somewhere new, you're really excited to be there, and then sometimes the shine kind of wears off. But to be honest, I really haven't felt that with Paris. Like, I'm still super happy. I have such a great community of friends there now, and I love it.
Do you find that Paris or France in general supports you differently as an artist than the US does?
Definitely, in a big way. I mean, there's the obvious things like, for example, we have the intermittent de spectacle artist status, where you have to get at least 43 days of declared work every year. And if you do that, you get the artist status where the government basically guarantees you a minimum salary every month. So if there's a month, for example, August, when there's basically no work, that you just don't have any gigs lined up, then the government steps in and pays you your minimum salary. So you don't have that like impending disaster of a month with no work lined up that you can get when you don't have that status, which is so great and reassuring just to know that you have some kind of security net and that you're not having to always plan to, okay, I better save up every single little penny just in case there's a dry spell later on. So that's a huge difference. There's also just, I find, a lot more sort of gig and event kind of work in France than there is in, for example, in New York, when I lived in New York. I think it's just a cultural thing of like, they're having the office Christmas party. So let's hire a show to come in and do a show, or an artist, or, something. I think there's just a lot more of that kind of culture of let's bring in some sort of performance into our event. So you just end up having a lot more options for random one-day kind of gigs, which is really, really nice. Especially like this year, I've been trying to really focus more on short contracts and gig kind of work, because I want to be more in Paris than I have been in previous years. In previous years, I've done a lot of contracts where I'm away for 2 or 3 or 4 months. And so there's just a lot of opportunity for that. And it's possible to kind of stay centered in your city without having to travel too much.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I think that because of this intermittent de spectacle status, you can really concentrate on only being an artist, but you can concentrate on being an artist instead of having to also be a waiter or a bartender or whatever else.
Absolutely.
And I think maybe along with that, culturally, it sort of engenders a respect for the arts, because you are always an artist and you get to say, I'm always this thing, instead of saying, well, I'm also a waiter.
Yeah. And I think that like culturally, obviously that's a great opportunity for your life to be able to focus on your art and to, if I need to go train to prepare for a gig, then I have that day to go train. I'm not having to work it around my other job. And also I think just like kind of subconsciously, it really supports your mental well-being as an artist, because I've worked in other places where that's not a possibility, where you do have to have a second job. And I have so many friends who are in, other countries in the US where you have to really have that second job. And I think it kind of wears you down when you're kind of like having to kind of prove to yourself all the time that you are an artist and not just, a barista or a bartender or whatever. Like, because I think it's very difficult to maintain your self-worth as an artist when maybe you haven't had a gig in a little while and you're just kind of going into work at whatever day job you have every day. And I think that mentally it's very supportive just to know like, okay, I am an artist. That is my full-time life.
Yeah. And I'm recognized as an artist officially.
Absolutely.
It's also nice. Yeah. So we've sort of danced around this, pardon the pun, but what is your particular art form? What do you do?
Well, I do a lot of different things. I started as a classical ballet dancer and I went to school, through my teens for that. And then I danced with a couple of different classical ballet companies. And then because I am super tall, I'm 5'10", I started doing cabaret. So those kind of big showgirl shows with the feathers and the beautiful costumes and all that, where being tall is a massive advantage. And then after doing that for a few years, I started doing aerial arts, which is, if you're in the circus, anything you see hanging from the ceiling, that's aerial. So it's circus arts. And I've been doing aerial for about 9 years now. And I've been doing it as sort of my main gig for about 4 or 5 years. So now I do mostly aerial work, but I do still dance in different shows when something comes up or that I'm interested in doing as a dancer.
It's so fascinating. So there's so much in there that I want to ask you about. So you started as a ballet dancer. How old were you when you first started dancing?
Oh, like 3 or 4, like
yeah,
tiny baby. But really, like with ballet, honestly, like you can start when you're 3 or 4, and a lot of people do because their parents put them into a class. But it's not really like super beneficial until you're maybe 8, 9, 10. And to be honest, there are people who start when they're 12, 13, 14, 15, that, if you have the body that you can adapt to it, you can start later on and work hard and get up to the professional level as well. So for me, I started very early, but, it was not a necessity.
Was there a moment where you thought to yourself, this is what I want to do?
I think that from when I started, I sort of knew that. Like, I think my whole life that was always kind of like the main thing, like dancing and putting the focus on that was always kind of the main thing for me. I think when I was a kid, there were some points where I was like, well, I want to teach dance and I want to be a teacher, because that was kind of the only like adult that I saw doing dancing was a teacher. But then when I kind of got to be more towards like a young teenager or preteen, I kind of realized that, you can actually do this professionally, like performing. And then I was set on that from the moment I realized that was an option.
I had the exact same moment. I remember that something clicked in my head and I realized that the people in the TV were actual people and not just images. And I was like, oh, that's a thing you can do. And I was like, that's what. Do you come from a family of dancers?
Nope, not at all.
Interesting.
Not at all. I'm the first performer of any sort, except my dad and my uncle are very, very musical. Neither of them was ever professional, but like they play like 5 or 6 instruments each, so that was always like a thing in my life, that like music and arts were there. But apart from that, there's no one who's a performer or any kind of performing artist.
I don't know. This might be a difficult question to answer, but how do you feel the experience of being in your body?
That is a really interesting question. I was talking with my boyfriend about this the other day, actually, because I was in my kitchen and I was just kind of standing near the dishwasher. And he's like, hey, like, isn't there something in the back of the dishwasher? And I was like, maybe. And I kind of like looked down. It's quite like, on the ground, because my dishwasher is like basically sitting on the ground. And he's like, yeah, look more. And after about 5 minutes, I realized that he was just doing it to see if I would bend my legs to look in the back of the dishwasher, which I didn't. Like every time I bend over, I just kind of keep my legs straight and do like the flexible person bend over, because for me, that's easier since my hamstrings are so loose. I don't have to have like the effort of like squatting down and getting back up. And there's a lot of things like that I just don't notice. Like, I think that because especially for me, I'm hypermobile, so I'm extremely flexible. And I use my body in a different way than like a lot of people would just in everyday life. Because for me, something like, okay, just keeping my legs completely straight and reaching down and touching the floor is zero effort. Whereas, like most people wouldn't want to do that. So I don't realize that I'm doing those things though, because that's how I've used my body my entire life. So when I think about, using my body in a different way, it seems very odd and like effortful and so I think that there's a lot of the experience of living in my body that I don't notice that maybe is kind of a weird and unusual thing, but
I don't know. This is a me thing, but I've always felt a real disconnect between like me and my body, like my brain and my body. So the idea of it being so integrated is fascinating to me. Do you just see your body as a form of self-expression, like you feel something and you just emit it from yourself?
I think that when I am just living in everyday life,
yeah,
obviously, like I speak and I use hand gestures and facial expressions to, complement what I'm saying, like everyone else does. But I don't think that I use my body as expression necessarily more than someone who's just naturally with an expressive gestural vocabulary would.
Yeah.
I do think like when I'm doing choreography or creating choreography or using my body in a professional sense and dancing or aerial or whatever I'm doing, I do see a lot of meaning in gestures, but I think that's a learned behavior. And I think it's something like crafted. I don't think it's necessarily like a natural thing that like, I think there's a lot of stereotype about dancers, especially that like there's a photographer who does a project called Dancers Among Us, which he does these beautiful photos and his work is gorgeous. But I always have like a little bit of an issue with the idea, because all of it's like a dancer who is at the counter in Chipotle ordering food, and she's in like a full back bend to take the food from the person who's handing it to her, or like in a full split penché, like trying to look at like something on a shelf in a shop. Like, and it's a bit like, like here are these superhumans that just naturally do this all of the time, and that's just how they are. And I'm like, actually, I find that is like a slightly problematic concept, because I think in a way it takes away legitimacy from the work and the craft of dancing, because it's certainly not something that you just emit. It's something that you plan and you fashion into a work of art. It's something that has to be really carefully thought through and rehearsed and created, and it's not just something that happens.
Yeah, that's very well said. It's a real skill, what you're doing. You have natural talent, but you have to work at that natural talent to make it into a real craft.
Yeah.
Does French culture sometimes leave you scratching your head? Well, you might enjoy listening to our sister podcast, Navigating the French, hosted by journalist Emily Monaco. Each episode focuses on a different word in the French language, and Emily is joined by an expert who will help explore what that word says about French culture. Listen now to Navigating the French on ParisUndergroundRadio.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be right back with City of Muses after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to City of Muses on Paris Underground Radio. So you went from ballet dancing to cabaret. Those feel like very different worlds to me. Were they? Was it a jolt to go from one to the other?
It was. Well, I did my first cabaret show when I was 21, and in a way wish that I could go, like, basically it was a long running show in Las Vegas, and it was called Jubilee. And it was such a massive, like, it was one of the biggest shows in Vegas. It was such a massive production. And I kind of always wanted to go back and do it again when I was a bit older. Like, I was there for like a year and a half doing that show. And I always kind of thought like, oh, I'll go back, when I'm in my late 20s or something and do it again and see how it is to do it a second time. And then the show closed. So that did not work out. But I wish I had done it when I was older, because I think when I was 21, I was so young and I was so, in a way, oblivious to like what cabaret can be and like the history and the truly like special nature of that I kind of wish I'd been able to go back when I could appreciate it a bit more I definitely appreciate it when I was doing it, but like when I kind of knew what was happening a bit more. As for like the dancing itself, the biggest difference is that you're in heels and in like giant costumes when you're doing a cabaret show. Some of the costumes in Jubilee could weigh up to 35 pounds. And so you have to adjust your dancing around that. And also cabaret, like ballet, I love because there is a right and a wrong in ballet. Like obviously there's a bit of subjectivity as well of like how you do a movement or how you are portraying a character or whatever. But, if your foot is here, it's right. If your foot is there, it's wrong. Like there is a black and white element to it, which is very nice to have in a way, to have that framework. And in cabaret, there was less of that, but there is still a lot of technique of like making your body look very long, making your lines very long, doing everything very elegantly. And I think that people don't see it so much because cabaret, when you kind of watch it not being a dancer, it looks more simple. But there's just so many tiny, tiny details that if they're right, they make a huge difference. So just kind of learning that. And I feel like with cabaret, like I did a job 2 weeks ago where we were doing like very traditional showgirl cabaret style. And even now I feel like I'm still working to like perfect it. Like there's such a interesting balance of grace and elegance and making yourself look long and using that ballet technique that lengthens all of your lines, but then also being very presentational and being very like interactive with the audience almost in a way. Like it's something that is very, very interesting to get into the layers of. So, and I think that people kind of miss that. They kind of think it's a stand and look pretty in a giant costume. And it's really a lot more than that.
Yeah. Were most of the other dancers also from a ballet background?
Yeah, I would say most girls who do cabaret and boys are from a ballet background or like a jazz musical theater kind of background.
Okay. And you hinted at something that I was going to ask you, which is how was your experience with the audience different doing ballet versus cabaret?
I personally, it's so bad, but until I started doing circus, I never really noticed a huge difference in audiences, because when you're dancing, I found for me that like the audience is there and you can feel if it's a good audience or a bad audience. If it's a good audience who's like really excited and clapping a lot and energetic, or if it's an audience that's kind of just like sitting there waiting for the show to happen in front of them. But I never noticed like a big difference in the audience. Also, I am extremely nearsighted. And so there are a lot of people who will look in the audience and be like, oh, like this person's not really watching, or this person is really into it, or that person's wearing a crazy dress, like, things like that. And I literally can't see that far. So I've never been someone who like is really super like focused on looking at individual people in the audience. However, that did change a lot when I started doing circus, because although I still can't see the audience, when you're doing circus, you have a really heightened level of interaction with the audience because there are moments when you want them to applaud. And so for me, like for instance, I was doing a new act. I was doing my contortion act, which is quite new, in Bayonne in March for a circus for 2 weeks. And really what that 2 weeks was about for me was playing with the timing and how I held different movements to get the maximum applause.
Oh, wow.
Because people don't start clapping until you've held a position for 2 or 3 seconds, because you're kind of telling them, okay, this is an important trick. Like, now is the time to be impressed. And so a lot of that was just me experimenting with like how to get the best reaction out of the audience. So when you're doing circus, it's really, really a one-on-one experience with really interacting with them.
That's really interesting. Yeah, that makes sense to me too, especially if you're doing, like you said, tricks that should be noticed and you want the audience to point out like, hey, this is a cool thing I'm doing. Look at this. That's amazing. Did you find yourself as a performer interacting with the audience differently in the ballet and cabaret worlds, or was it sort of the same kind of relationship?
You certainly don't have the freedom when you're doing choreography, whether it's ballet or cabaret, to, again, like play with those timings, unless you're a soloist. I'd say the one exception is maybe if you're a soloist more in the ballet world, you can have a little bit more freedom. But with dance choreography, you're so locked into the timing, the counts, the specific choreography that there's just not as much opportunity to do that. Obviously, with your acting, you can still do that, but it's just, I would say ballet and cabaret are more about watching the show as a whole and the show being presented as a group effort, whereas circus is, especially for what I do, very much a solo thing. And there's just a lot more opportunity for that kind of thing.
All right, so let's talk about the circus stuff. How did you get into aerialism?
I was in New York and I had done several shows where I had seen people doing aerial acts. And I was like, oh, I'd really like to try that. And I went to an aerial class with my best friend, Megan, and tried a hoop, aerial hoop or lyra. And it was like maybe June, like early June, something like that. And I really liked it. I was definitely like, okay, I definitely want to like keep this up. I really enjoyed this. And about a week after that, I stepped in a hole on the street.
Oh no.
And broke my foot.
Oh no.
And the rest of that summer, I couldn't dance at all. I could barely walk. But actually, it was kind of the best thing that could have happened, because that whole summer, all I did was aerial class. It's like, well, this will keep me in shape and I could do it without one foot. So in a way, it was just like the best thing that could have happened to me, because it really pushed me to improve much faster than I would have otherwise with the aerial and really focus on that training.
That's funny. So the universe was like, get off the ground.
Yeah, exactly.
Stop using your feet. So what is it that you like so much about these aerial acts?
I love actually doing it. I love in a way, it has that same black and white thing as ballet, where everything's a bit clear cut. Like, you're either doing the trick or you're not doing the trick. And there's not a lot of subjectivity in the middle, which is really nice, because I like that, oh, I've done it correctly. Okay, done, I also really like spinning with a lot of aerial apparatuses, like hoop, which is my main base, or hammock or net or straps or moon, or like a lot of the other things I do. You spin very fast the whole act, and I really love to spin.
Really?
And I like that I can create my own act and really kind of have completely creative control most of the time over that. I do the choreography, I choose the music, I pick out my costume, I, do the whole concept. And then I kind of just turn up and bring my act. And there's not 2 weeks of rehearsal. Like with dancing, there's not all of the faff, all of the extra hassle. Like, I just have my own self-contained thing that I get to create. And that's really great.
So when you're creating a piece of choreography, where do you start?
Normally I start with music. It's a bit tricky to find music sometimes, because it needs to be something that's between 4 and 6 minutes long normally. It needs to be something that doesn't clash with the movement I'm doing. So like a lot of things that are too, not necessarily fast, but too like super high energy, doesn't match the movement that I'm doing, but also things that are too slow don't match. And so I normally start with, I have a playlist that every time I hear a song that I think could work good for aerial, I just add that to the playlist.
Yeah.
And then I also like to have like a concept, like maybe it's just, expressing what the song is, but then like I also do things like I have an act where I'm the Cheshire Cat from Alice in Wonderland, I'm on the moon, and like something like that. And then thinking also about, what apparatus am I doing? What kind of tricks, what kind of vibe do I want the act to have? But the base is probably normally the music.
I've seen on your social media that you practice this all over the place. Is it difficult to find places to practice?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, I'm super fortunate now because about a year and a half ago, I bought a house in the center of France because you can buy things extraordinarily cheaply. Like, it's ridiculous. And I bought the house because I want to start doing like aerial retreats and workshops.
Oh, wow.
And so eventually that's going to be like a massive aerial training space. But this year I've gotten 2 aerial rigging points set up at the house. So I now have like my own space that I can go and train, which is so nice, because it really is like in Paris, because you need like a big space for circus training. Everything tends to be in the banlieue. Everything tends to be like outside of central Paris. So like the place that I go to train in Paris is great. And it's a great space, but it's an hour away from my apartment on the metro, which is problematic. So yeah, having the space at my house is so helpful. And now it's only 2 rigging points to train on, but soon there's a big barn. I'm going to renovate the barn to be an aerial studio, and that'll be another 5 places. And it's going to be great. I'm so excited about it.
That's so cool. Yeah, I guess that must be your backyard that I've been seeing in the pictures.
Yeah, that's my terrace.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And so you mentioned contortionism as well. This is a new evolution for you?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that I've been doing for a while, but I've just recently like turned it into an act, because I don't do like necessarily like traditional contortion, but I do an act that's kind of a mix of hand balancing, contortion, and I have a folding chair, and I do like balancing and contortion on the chair. So I just needed to have some kind of ground act, because sometimes there are jobs where they aren't able to do aerial rigging. So having a floor act is really, really useful. And so I just needed to find some kind of ground act. So I kind of mixed several different things together and kind of just created what I thought would be the most unusual ground act out of the stuff that I already do.
Interesting. You said you're doing mostly gig acts now. Is that right? So is there a different sense of like the camaraderie, I guess, with the people that you're working with?
Yeah. Well, the thing with doing gigs around Paris is that you know everybody.
Yeah. Okay.
So like I was doing something like last week where I literally knew every person. I'd worked before with every person who was doing it. And not because like we work as a troupe or anything, just because there's, 30 people who are in that world like full time. So you just know everybody. That's really nice. Like I really enjoy having that community, but it's also really nice that like, oh, okay, at this gig, I'm working with Galina and Emily and Lauren. And at this gig next week, I'm working with Tim and, this person, like,
yeah,
like it's still nice to have like the mix up of, different people, different days. And then I do also a lot of like sort of 2-week, 3-week, month-long contracts. Like this one I'm doing right now is 3 weeks long. And so you do get to know people and have a bit of camaraderie with that as well. But also like, I think that part of when you change over to being like a solo circus act, part of that is just kind of being like, okay, well, I'm happy to work with people. I'm happy to make friends and do all that. But I'm also cool being on my own. Like, it's kind of that acceptance of that possibility.
Have you always dreamed of owning a place in Paris? If you're planning on moving, renting, buying, or selling a place in France, you'll need the expert guidance of Gaëlle Boisclair and Marie Pistinier, hosts of the Paris Estate of Mind podcast. Listen now to Paris the State of Mind on parisundergroundradio.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be right back with City of Muses after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to City of Muses on Paris Underground Radio. Do you find that the productions themselves, like what goes into the production itself and all the inner workings there, are different in France versus other places that you've worked?
Well, I've worked in a wide variety of situations. And to me, France is like my baseline, is my normal. And even here, though, there's a wide variety of styles of production that you work in. For example, like even within France, there's a massive difference between when you're doing a traditional circus versus when you're doing a cabaret versus I worked at the opera last year. Like that's massively different. Like there's just a wide variety in general, even within France. I would say, like, because I've also worked in Asia quite a lot. I worked in Morocco a couple years ago. I worked in the US, obviously. Like, I would say that France is sort of in the middle of when you, well, actually, I wouldn't say that. I would say that cabaret productions in France tend to be sort of the middle on a level of like organization. And it really depends where you're working because everything can be so wildly different one from another. When I worked at the opera was so well organized, at least for us. My boyfriend actually works at the opera full time. And so I do, like, obviously, like when you work full time, there's frustrations and there's other things. But like, you know, I think in general, the opera was probably one of the most organized things that I've done, which was lovely. Sometimes productions in Asia were very interesting, we'll say. Well, I have to say that when I worked in Asia, a lot of the times the focus was not on the show. It was on the venue and the, venue being a, dinner with the show or drink with the show or a casino or whatever. And a lot of times the show kind of got pushed back to the background, which was frustrating. But, sometimes that happens.
I guess different levels of respect, maybe, or importance.
I think that, well, the whole idea, like, for instance, when I worked in Macau, it was such a nice show and it was I had such a good experience in Macau. But yeah, like the focus was 100% on like, we are a casino with a show, not we're a show with a casino or equal parts. It was very much like the show's there to complement the casino. Whereas like in Vegas, it was the same deal. It's like the casino and the show, but the show was as important in a way as the casino, or at least it felt that way.
I see. Right now, are you still doing all of these different forms? Are you still doing ballet and cabaret and circus act? Are you still doing?
Yeah. Well, right now I'm in the Alps. I'm doing a show here where I'm doing 2 aerial acts, which is super fun. And I'm really enjoying it. It's a really nice show. It's a really nice venue. Everybody on the team's really, really nice. And then I'm still doing, I would say I do probably like 75% circus and then 25% dance jobs now. There's not as much call for like freelance ballet dancers. So I don't do that quite as often. I do more like cabaret or just sort of like generic contemporary kind of dance when I'm working as a dancer. But yeah, it's still a fair amount of dance jobs that I get to do, which is nice.
And do you find yourself attracted to different mediums at different times?
Yeah, I think at different times I get more interested in, okay, I want to work more in traditional circus where it's just like each person does their number, but I want to like really like create some new number that is really like interesting. And maybe it's kind of like this, and maybe it's, this is the concept because I have an idea for this concept. And then sometimes I get more interested in like, oh, I want to do something that's more like modern circus where it's like everything's kind of mixed together and more a complete show with everybody doing the complete show. Or maybe I want to work more on like creating my own choreography to do something like combining dance and aerial. Like, I think I get interested in like different project themes, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, it sounds like you just have a natural curiosity for whatever is interesting next.
Yeah, yeah. And I just, for me, like the thing is now that I don't really have anything on my like professional life list. Like I think when you're younger and when you're starting out, there's like, okay, I want to work here and I want to work here and I want to work here. And for me at this point, like I don't really like I've kind of ticked off the things that I really wanted to do. And I am much more about just like making work that is interesting to me. So, like, for instance, like I auditioned for a cabaret recently where it was just dancing, and I was just kind of like, basically because it was convenient for my life, like the schedule of shows are convenient for my life. And it was very close to where my boyfriend lives, where that would have been extremely convenient for my life. But I was just kind of like, do I want to do this? Like, it's another sort of a type of show that I've done many times before. And I was just kind of like in the audition, like, like this is nice. I'm enjoying it, but like, it's not sparking off a great deal of like joy within me. But then interestingly, something that is sparking off like a great deal of joy within me right now is doing YouTube and doing like creating content, because I have an aerial YouTube channel where I do like aerial tutorials and videos about aerial and being an aerialist and working in the circus and like that kind of thing. And like that really is very rewarding to do. It's very interesting to me that I'm saying that, because I don't think I would have said that 5 or 6 or 7 years ago. Like I think I was so about like, I must perform at high level venues. And now I'm like, yeah, but actually like what I'm creating on YouTube is kind of like equally interesting to me in a way. And I'm about to start a second YouTube channel with my house and just showing like the renovation of the house and how I'm turning it into an aerial space. And like the house itself is really, really cool. It's 223 years old. And basically the people who sold it to me like left all of their possessions in it because they're like, we don't want to move, so we're just going to leave you everything. And I'm like, I keep finding like I found a violin from 1920.
Oh, wow.
Just in a drawer. So like I'm going to start a YouTube channel kind of following that journey, which first off to build people's interest for when I'm doing aerial retreats and workshops there in the future. And also just to kind of like have another source of income where that can help pay for some of the renovations that I'm doing.
Yes.
And to be honest, like doing that kind of work and doing that kind of content creation is really kind of sparking my interest a lot at the moment. So that's kind of what I'm trying to make more time for in my life. So that's really, it's nice. It's something different.
Amazing. Well, so I'll include links to those YouTube channels in our show notes so that people can find you.
Thank you.
And where else can people find you if they want to keep up to date with what you're doing?
Well, definitely the thing that is the most regular is my YouTube.
Okay.
My YouTube is Cara Chapman Aerial Pole. And the house channel has not launched yet, but it will be Escape to Everdeen, Everdeen. And it's going to launch probably in the next couple of weeks. So those are definitely like the most regularly updated things. There's also my Instagram that's Cara Chapman Aerial. And that I'm trying to be more regular, like updating that and doing stories and things. I'm getting better. So yeah, that's the where to find me online.
Fabulous. Thank you, Cara. This was such a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Yeah, it's been great. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to City of Muses. If you like what you've heard, please take a moment to rate and review it. This is the fastest and easiest way to help support the podcast. Tell a friend who could use a little inspiration. You can also subscribe to the Paris Underground Radio newsletter over on our website, which comes out every Sunday and gives a little peek into what's on the network for the week ahead. I'm your host, Jennifer Garrity, and you can find me on all socials at Jennyphoria. That's JennyPhoria. Thank you for listening, and may you find inspiration wherever you go. City of Muses was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio.